This is a 2025 buyer representation agreement for independent real estate agents, but even realtors can use this because this form conforms with the NAR settlement requirements and even state laws, like California has recently enacted a law effective January 1st, 2025. All real estate licensees, this includes non-realtors, must have a buyer representation agreement in place. And it's possible other states will enact legislation similar to this. This one's just 3 pages, but very thorough, covers everything you need. This is actually the California version, which is nearly identical to the version that can be used in other states. There's just literally one line difference that I'll show you. Now, we start by putting the buyer names here on the top, line 1, the name of the brokerage representing the buyer on line 4. Representation period cannot exceed 3 months. This is in line with the NAR settlement terms, with California state law. And as other states enact laws, it's likely to mirror the NAR settlement because that's who's lobbying to create the law. And so we're just making this form so it conforms so that all independent agents can have access in their own state to use this form. Start date and an end date. You must have both. If one of these is left blank, this form could be unenforceable. So make sure to put both in here, and that this period from start to end is not more than 3 months. Then you'll put the geographic area. So you can put in the city or the county, or if you want to put in a specific address or something that isn't mentioned or covered by the city or county lines, go ahead and write that here. But write something on lines 10 through 12. You must write something here. Compensation, we have this nice little advisory line to protect you since everything is so litigious now that basically real estate commission is negotiable and not set by law. And then for compensation, I'm doing the most standard form. I'm just checking this box, writing in 2.5% of the sales price. You can do a flat fee by checking this box and writing in here, or you can do a combination of the two, or you can make up a totally different item. And you can even write in additional terms here. Now, you should not write in something about how this number changes if something happens. For example, if the seller doesn't pay your commission, then you aren't going to charge anything. You must be definitive about what you're charging. It can't be an if X then Y scenario down here. That creates problems as well. That does create potential unenforceability of this form and all sorts of potential problems in the future. So make sure that you have it a very clear and concise commission structure, whatever you do, not that it's subject to something happening later. Representation period. Now, this just basically explains that there's a 3-month maximum representation period. You can read through it. I won't go through it. It's just standard boilerplate verbiage. And that the execution must happen as soon as practicable. Now, this is all just in line with the legal code that was enacted in law in California and is kind of setting the path for what happens when states enact legislation. It's going to mirror the NAR settlement. That's just the reality of it. So that's why we're making this to be in line with the California state law and also the terms of the NAR settlement, because that's basically the standard going forward for buyer representation agreements all over the country. Now, so compensation terms, pretty straightforward. It's due upon successful completion of the transaction, and it defines as when recording happens. Both parties initial at the bottom. Now it says broker initials, but it can be the agent too. It doesn't have to be the broker of the office. It can be the buyer's agent and then the buyer. Now, this is very important because we know that most buyers expect someone else to pick up the tab on their behalf. That's just the state of the industry, period. Independent or realtor or whatever you want to call it, the state of the industry is that the seller is paying, and historically it's been a listing broker up until the huge lawsuit that changed a lot of things. So when the buyer asks you about their obligation to pay, you can point them out to the very top of page 2, which is line 36. We're on page 2. Any compensation paid to the broker from the seller or any other party, so even if it's from the listing broker or whomever, that amount shall be deducted from the amount due from the buyer as stipulated in this agreement. So whatever stipulated here, in this case 2.5%, well, whoever pays the broker, that amount is going to be deducted. So if the seller pays me 2.5%, that amount is deducted. And that's what a buyer is going to look for in a representation agreement. How do I know that if you're paid from the seller or someone else, that it relieves me, the buyer, from my obligation to pay you? Well, you just point them right here, line 36, and say, hey, anything I'm paid from anyone related to this transaction, it's deducted from the amount that you owe me, okay? And that is meant to explain to them and offer them peace of mind that you're not just collecting money from everywhere while they're still on the hook to pay. Now, broker duty is defined here, but not limited to doing certain activities that are duties by a broker. And it's important because part of being protected in this form is that if you do work on a property, if you do a broker duty and the buyer tries to cut you out or go around you or do a deal with you after this expires, you're still entitled to compensation. You're protected. This form protects you. And I'll explain down here in the protection period. But this disclosure form, this one line is for California. This form is identical in every other state. This is just the California version. Termination. Now, of course, expiration is one way that this agreement can end. But the parties can agree to terminate early if by mutual written consent. Maybe a buyer and their broker just have decided they want to go different ways, or the buyer's not interested anymore, or the broker wants to fire the buyer because they're driving him nuts. I mean, anything can happen. And in a case of early termination, they can both sign to terminate this. But even then, there's a protection period. Now, I'm going to read this part to you because this is very important. If the buyer completes a transaction on any property in which you did broker duties, and it explains a few of them, subject to, or including but not limited to, within 30 days after this expires, or 30 days after the early termination, and now you can change this. You can write 90 days if you want, but 30 is the standard. It's the boilerplate, okay? 30 is totally reasonable in my opinion. Well, the terms of this agreement shall extend for the duration of such transaction, and compensation shall be due to the broker upon successful completion. Now, when this expires, or if you do an early termination, you have 5 days to give the buyer a list of all properties where you performed broker duties. But this protects you, very important. And then we're basically done with the form. There's dispute resolution. By default, the parties go to mediation. You and the buyer have an issue, you go to mediation first. Both parties initial. You can elect to do arbitration if you want, or skip it and just do mediation. And then you sign and the buyer signs down here on the bottom. This is on page 3, and you're done. That's it. It's a 3-page form. Covers all the bases, super simple, not too long and complex. Now in California, there's a state required disclosure that basically you're stating that you're their agent, and it's right here. This is attached because in California, you must deliver this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship with the representation agreement. So for California, I have this bundled together. And that's it, just 3 pages. Now, Cavour Realty is an independent real estate brokerage with no realtor affiliation, yet has all the tools agents need to sell properties. If you're an agent looking for a brokerage where you're not required to join a trade association, visit CavourRealty.com.